Sigmund Freud lived between the years of 1856 to 1939. It is hard to imagine the history of science without mentioning his name. Along with Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Albert Einstein, he helped revolutionize the modern Western conception of human life and our place in the universe. Each person's life is documented in more than one way. Official personal history, how we see ourselves, for instance, or unofficial personal history, our desires, anxieties, traumas that are not conscious. Our unconscious histories contained our impossible or forbidden wishes. Our fantasies, for example, are repressed from the official record. Our fantasies and anxieties are not spoken, but that doesn't mean that they do not exist. In fact, they remain active in the unconscious. These repressed desires, according to Freud, are expressed in our dreams, linguistic mistakes, jokes, myths, and some hidden forms of communication, such as how we look at people, how we approach people, how we stand next to people, or how we touch those people. So we can say that each person has a history. Some of this history is written, that is to say, how we talk about ourselves, what we say about ourselves, and unwritten. As I've mentioned before, our repressed feelings, traumas, anxieties, and desires. As I have mentioned before, these repressed, these pushed down realities do exist. And according to Freud and many psychologists and psychiatrists today, these repressed feelings and experiences bring many different problems to us in society. Anxiety, some other psychological disorders, feeling of loneliness, depression, and so on. So, without Freud, we cannot say that psychology today would exist the way it is now. When Freud started work, we have to know that, we have to remind us about the fact that an official branch of study such as psychology or psychiatry did not exist. So we owe a lot to this figure in the history of sciences. Psychoanalysis is the name for the theory studying all the hidden, unseen motives or pushes that cause people to act in a certain way. The psychoanalytic theory set by Sigmund Freud has been used by critics in the study of the most canonical as well as the most ordinary texts. Today, to understand how, we will start exploring Sigmund Freud and his work. And why? Because he is the guy. Freud was born in Moravia, in what is now the Czech Republic, to poor Jewish parents. The Freuds moved to Vienna in 1860, where Sigmund obtained all his education. Although psychoanalysis today is associated with infantile sexuality, Freud began his career as a clinical neurologist, obtaining his medical degree in 1881. He entered the University of Vienna in 1873 at a time when Jews were already being scapegoated for Austria's economic problems. When Germans annexed Austria in 1938, Freud left Vienna, running away from Hitler's coming hostility towards the Jews. Freud died in 1939 with a legal dose of morphine given by his doctor, who acted to do so on Freud's permission and demand. Sigmund Freud is the founder of psychoanalysis. For Freud, human reason included a body of defense mechanisms struggling against and often motivated by our unconscious desires. His theory and practice of psychoanalysis have changed the way people think about themselves today, whether we are aware of it or not. Freud's attention to language may help explain why his writings have grown in importance for literary scholars. Yet perhaps it is also in large part because his writings emerge in the intersection of both literature and science. Most probably, that's why Freud continues to fascinate us, because he developed his theories while working with numerous patients, listening to them, each and all of them, for hours, taking no notes but listening to them carefully. So we can say that psychoanalysis developed as a type of narrative research, a research that is based on the narratives of numerous patients. Let's remember some of the things we have learned in previous coursework and relate them to our study of psychoanalytic theory. The question is, if you want to study Freud's life in relation to his writings, which school of criticism will be the most useful? Remember, your aim is to study Freud's life in relation to his work. So what kind of analysis would you use? A, formalism, B, Marxism, C, historical biographical criticism, D, structuralism, and E, cultural criticism. And your answer is yes, option C is the right answer. You will use historical facts and Freud's biography or autobiography to study how his life affected his works. Most probably, you got this right. While working to obtain his medical degree, Freud was distracted by his broad interests in research. He became fascinated by the account given by the respected physician Joseph Breuer, whose famous work on a particularly intelligent hysterical patient, Anna O, changed how many people perceived hysteria. Anna was often considered the first patient of psychoanalysis, although Freud himself never treated her. 15 years later, Freud and Breuer would write studies on hysteria in 1895 about this and later cases. Although psychology or psychiatry did not exist as fields of study during Freud's lifetime, there were some experimentalists who performed some sort of psychological treatment or at least data collection method to help the patients. Hypnosis is one of them. Now, hypnosis is a trance-like mental state in which people experience increased attention, concentration, and suggestibility. In a sleep-like state, therefore, patients start talking about what they have been not telling to many others around them. While hypnosis is often described as a sleep-like state, it is better expressed as a state of focused attention, heightened suggestibility, and vivid fantasies. People in a hypnotic state often seem sleepy and zoned out, but in reality, they are in a state of hyper-awareness. Hypnosis has been shown to have medical and therapeutic benefits, most notably in the reduction of pain and anxiety. Hypnotism became more important in the field of psychology in the late 19th century and was used by Jean-Martin Charcot to treat women experiencing what was then known as hysteria. This work influenced Sigmund Freud and the development of psychoanalysis. Well, I know you love quizzes, so here is another one for you. Who were the authors of studies on hysteria? A. Freud and Karl Marx. B. Freud and Alfred Adler. C. Freud and Schopenhauer. D. Freud and Brouwer. E. Freud and Charcot. And the answer is in order to understand Freud's work, we have to have a look at 19th century and by focusing on social life. It is important because most of Freud's patients were women, and at that period, at that moment, or in that specific century, 19th century, there was a widespread psychological disorder, which was not really named back then as a psychological disorder, but there was a problem with numerous women. So in order to understand this health-based problem, we should have an understanding of how Freud studied his patients, mainly women. And in order to understand these patients and how Freud started to see their problems, we have to look at society by and large. You will understand what I mean in a couple minutes. Now, in Western Europe, during the 19th century, economic changes produced massive social consequences. Basic aspects of daily life changed and work was increasingly redefined. Duration of work everywhere remained long, up to 14 hours a day. Women and children were widely used for the less skilled operations. Remember, in Charles Dickens' novels, there are numerous examples to children who are exploited as either as workers or as street children or extremely poor children. Drinking, though disapproved by middle-class critics, was an important recreational outlet, bringing men together at bars, as bars flourished throughout working-class sections of town. In this particular 19th century, men worked very hard and for very long hours, and after work they spent most of their time at bars drinking alcohol, and women either were exploited at work, and even if they remained home, they did numerous chores at home, raising kids and cleaning, cooking, and trying to um, make the daily life run smoothly, which was a very problematic situation for numerous women in Western Europe. The growth of cities and industry had a vital impact on family life. In general, most urban groups tended to respond to the separation of home and work by redefining gender roles, so that married men became the family breadwinners and women were the domestic specialists. In the typical working class family, women were expected to work from their early teens, as early as they were children, through marriage a decade or so later. The majority of women workers in the cities went into domestic service in middle-class households. So they were mostly employed as house workers. But an important minority of women labored in factories, while another minority became prostitutes. Some women continued working outside the home after marriage, but most pulled back to tasks such as laundering that could be done domestically. Women also were involved in other activities such as shopping for the family, which was an arduous, difficult task because of that limited budget, caring for children, and maintaining contacts with other relatives who might support the family socially and provide aid or help during economic hardships. As you can see, although men stick to one work and worked as breadwinners, women had to work as multitasking individuals, which was first of all not only problem for the body but for the brain as well. Back then, remember, there was no such thing as psychology or psyche or soul or etc. in the sense that we understand today. But women were exploited, and they had to work at different tasks at the same time, which was tiring for them from a psychological perspective. Middle-class ideals held the family to be a sacred place and women its chief agents because of their moral values and domestic devotion. Therefore, every woman, except for prostitutes, every woman was expected to be the most important symbol of all the values and religious and cultural and national ideals ascribed to them in their homes. Many middle-class families also began in the early 19th century to limit their birth rate, mainly through increasing sexual abstinence. Therefore, because having too many children could complicate the family's economic well-being, and therefore, to prevent the necessary attention and support for the children who were desired, many men tried not to have sex with their wives. This particular reality was also expressed in 19th century novels. Most women appear having headaches, for instance, or cramps, which are the footsteps of what is to come, the real problem, psychological problem associated with women at that period, which we call hysteria. I have mentioned the fact that prostitution became very popular in the 19th century England and France. Rates of illegitimate births began to rise rapidly throughout Western Europe from 1780, from 2 to 4 up to 10% of total births. This increase was visible both in young rural as well as urban workers. Sexual pleasure or its quest became more important for young adults. Similar symptoms developed among some middle-class men who exploited female servants, or the growing numbers of brothels that dotted the large cities and that often did exceptional business during school holidays. So, exploiting female servants as a theme or as a motive might be familiar to you when you read 19th century British novels, for instance. Respectable young middle-class women held back from these trends, of course. They were, however, increasingly drawn to beliefs in a romantic marriage, which became part of the new family ideal. However, as soon as they entered marriage, as soon as they married, these respectable women realized that their husbands did give them little attention they deserved. In the 19th century England or Western Europe, the only problem was not between males and females. There was another growing social and cultural problem, which had very serious religious consequences. This problem was anti-Semitism. Now, anti-Semitism is hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious or racial group. The term anti-Semitism was coined in 1879 by Wilhelm Marr, who called for anti-Jewish campaigns in Central Europe. Although the term now has wide currency, it's a misnomer since it implies a discrimination against all Semites. Now, Arabs and other peoples are also Semites, but the term anti-Semitism is used only to include the Jews, because in the 19th century Europe, Jews were the only Semitic people in the continent. Freud, being a Jew, was affected from anti-Semitic pressure throughout his life. So this 19th century in Western Europe was a problematic era, not only for sexual reasons, but for also ethnic and religious reasons as well. All these bring us into the analysis of the psychological problems people were experiencing, and we will talk about them soon. Studying his patients, Freud realized that language was of paramount importance in order to understand the life and condition of his patients. Freud's theory would have been impossible without the meticulous study of the discredited forms of knowledge revealed by dreams, slips of tongue, memory lapses, and jokes. All are narrative materials rather than imaginary materials. So even if we talk about our dreams, we put our dreams in words. So we use language to realize our dreams in social circles. Therefore, Freud paid particular attention to how people used language, which will help us in our understanding of literary texts. And we will do it next week, but try to understand the potential and importance of language in understanding one's psychological situation, which was extremely important for Freud, because without that narrative material, linguistic material, Freud could not develop his theory. And even today, if you go to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, you have to give that narrative material, linguistic material. This is not something that a medical doctor who is working with internal organs or brain or heart or skin problems deal with. Psychologists and psychiatrists are specifically relying on that linguistic material, which is a very important connection between Freud's theory and the literary text as a psychological material. In the years leading up to his groundbreaking work titled Interpretation of Dreams, which was published in 1900, Freud began a formative and intellectually wide-ranging correspondence with Wilhelm Fleiss. Wilhelm Fleiss was an ear, nose, and throat specialist from Berlin. In his practice, Freud gradually abandoned the hypnotic treatments for hysteria recommended by Charcot. Rather than using hypnosis, Freud substituted this treatment, hypnosis, with a dialogue, a form of dialogue between the patient and the doctor. This is how therapy was born. At first, convinced that many of his patients had suffered sexual abuse or seduction by their fathers in childhood, Freud later came to realize that some of his patients' tales of sexual events were fantasies. Therefore, some of his patients were coming to Freud with stories about how their fathers exploited them sexually. But by studying this narrative, linguistic material very carefully, Freud recognized that these patients were not telling the truth. Rather, these narratives were pure, mere fantasies. What he called the abandonment of the seduction theory has become controversial in recent decades, criticized as an abandonment of the realities of childhood sexual abuse. So today many people think that maybe Freud was wrong and his patients were really telling the truth. But the shift was not first and foremost a denial of the reality of incest. Freud saw in fantasies of incest a psychic reality. So incest was a reality, but it was a reality of fantasy and an infantile sexuality that had to be taken seriously in itself. Therefore, Freud started to see that the child was a box of many sexual fantasies in development. So they were not like pure angels, but they were working minds, working psyches that gradually developed forms of sexual fantasies and sexual realities, sexual desires, and so on. So in that sense, for Freud, each person, first and foremost, was a sexual being. Let's talk about the Oedipus and Electra complexes to make our understanding of the importance of sexuality in children's lives, from a Freudian perspective, of course. Now, the main difference between the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex is that the Oedipus complex is relevant to both girls and boys, while the Electra complex is specifically relevant to girls. Now, remember Sophocles' famous play titled Oedipus Rex, in which Oedipus unknowingly marries his mother. Sigmund Freud developed the concept of Oedipus complex to describe a child's sexual desire for the parent of the opposite sex and a sense of rivalry with the parent of the same sex. Therefore, according to this theoretical position, a boy, for instance, wants to or desires his mother's attention, and he competes with his father to get that. For children, continuous and tiring efforts to gain the love and attention of the parent of the opposite sex results in anxiety and suppression, because the child, because of the various rules, regulations, and taboos, cannot realize his or her desires. Therefore, he or she suppresses these feelings, and the result is anxiety. Later, Carl Jung introduced the Electra complex, which is the female equivalent of the Oedipus complex. Today, I think very few would refute or not accept the truth value of such arguments that boys are more inclined to the love and attention of their mothers, and girls are more inclined to get the attention and love of their fathers. So maybe Freud was hypothesizing on this popular family life reality. But the truth is that while Freud developed these ideas, interestingly, he found reflections of these in Sophocles' famous play, which was written almost 2,000 years before Freud wrote those lines. In that sense, the linkage, the relationship between literature and Freud's work was established as early as such hypotheses were formed. Of course, Freud was not the only person who linked literature and sciences during his lifetime. Remember, I have mentioned Charles Darwin's name in the beginning of this presentation. Charles Darwin was famous for evolution, his ideas on evolution. Now, evolution was the belief that lasting and beneficial change comes about by slow and small degrees. It is often imperceptible and therefore congenial to human habits. Evolution breaks no heads and spills no blood. It is natural and organic. The idea of evolution is patterned on biology, the slow growth and decay of living things. More than that, evolution in the zoological sense of descent with modification had been a recognized speculation among people of science since 1750s. Now, what do I mean here? Now, as early as the middle of the 18th century, the relationship between sciences, natural phenomena, and evolution had become a reality. In French literature, remember our discussions on realism and naturalism, Balzac wrote his huge array of novels as a social zoology. That was to show that bloody jungle society becomes without the church and the monarchy to restrain human passions. Therefore, humans were animals. humans, just like the chimpanzees or foxes or birds, were living in a jungle. But this jungle is not composed of a body of water, such as a big ocean, or a spring, or a forest, but the city. Therefore, this understanding of human society as social zoology was also reflected in the work of Freud, because in this in the world Freud created for his patients or with his patients, he realized that there were many competitions and many clashes between various individuals. But these clashes or conflicts were not merely biological, but also cultural, and they were they were formed in families. More interestingly, people developed, his patients, to be more exact, developed individualistic psychological conditions to survive in this jungle. So in that sense, the term social zoology is very important for to understand Freud's work as well. In this social zoology, hysteria, as I have mentioned before, was a very important problem. Hysteria is a psychoneurotic disorder characterized by violent emotional outbreaks, disturbances of sensory and motor functions, and various abnormal effects due to autosuggestion. During the 19th century, many women were supposed to suffer from hysteria at varying degrees. French neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot utilized hypnosis to treat women suffering from hysteria, something we have discussed so far. The mystery of hysteria played a major role in the early development of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud, as we have mentioned before, had studied with Charcot to understand and treat patients suffering from hysteria. With that first-hand experience, by listening to numerous patients, female patients suffering from hysteria, he explored Charcot's treatment methods while developing his own. If you look at a list of publications by Freud, you will see that his works are case studies. Each of his work is specifically written on a certain patient. For instance, fragment of an analysis of a case of hysteria is on Dora, a female patient. Analysis of a phobia in a 5-year-old boy is about a patient he called Little Hans. Another one, notes upon a case of obsessional neurosis, is on Ratman. From the history of an infantile neurosis, on Wolfman. So as you can see, his work, each of his work is a body of notes specifically written on cases. Therefore, this is interesting because we can treat every literary character we read in a novel, for instance, as a case, and we can explore this case by using Freudian methods. That's what Freud did, for instance. Reading closely something about these materials, you will see that each of these works has some limitations. Each of these studies was a result of a difficult psychoanalytic but also narrative challenge. For example, Dora left treatment before Freud was finished with her. Wolfman's childhood neurosis could be analyzed only through the screen of adult constructions. So Wolfman was an adult when he was being listened to by Freud. Schreber was analyzed not as Freud's patient, but as the author of an autobiography. All in all, as you can see, there is a connection between stories, literary material, and Freud's developing work as psychoanalytic theory. Well, we can say that hysteria was later named neurosis. A neurosis is the formation of behavioral or psychosomatic symptoms as a result of the return of the repressed. That is to say, something as human beings we push down throughout our lives come up to the surface, and then we start experiencing psychological and physical problems. It's a mental and emotional disorder that affects only part of the personality. Neurosis is accompanied by a distorted perception of reality. However, a neurotic patient's perception of reality is less distorted than that in psychosis. Neurotic patients do not have awkward use of language. However, they suffer from physical, physiological, and mental disturbances such as vomiting, headache, anxieties, or phobias. During Freud's lifetime, neurosis was a common problem, especially among women. The most influential view held by the psychoanalytic tradition is that neurosis arises from conflict between different drives, impulses, or motives held within various components of the mind. Central to psychoanalytic theory is the existence of an unconscious part of the mind, which, among other functions, acts as a repository for repressed thoughts, feelings, and memories that are disturbing or otherwise unacceptable to the conscious mind. That is to say, the things that we do not want to remember because of laws or rules or feeling of shame, we keep them in the unconscious. We do not let these experiences come to the surface. We do not want to verbalize or even remember them. These repressed mental contents are typically sexual or aggressive urges, or painful memories of an emotional loss, or an unsatisfied longing dating from childhood. Anxiety arises when these unacceptable and repressed drives threaten to enter consciousness. Prompted by anxiety, the conscious part of the mind, that is to say the ego, tries to use defense mechanisms such as repression, denial, or reaction formation. We will talk about these in the upcoming lessons. For the time being, we should keep it in mind that neurotic symptoms often begin when a previously impermeable defense mechanism breaks down and a forbidden drive or impulse threatens to enter consciousness. So whenever these repressed emotions or memories come to the surface to the point that it almost becomes something like verbalized, we experience anxiety or physiological problems such as vomiting or cramps and so on, or headache. In his essay, The Uncanny, which was written in 1919, and in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which was published in 1920, Freud started to focus on death. The death instinct, which is also known as the death drive or thanatos, was something that particularly uh, uh, made uh, Freud focus because of many reasons. One of these reasons was that Freud noticed something very peculiar, which was the libido. The libido in the individual is part of a more generalized drive, which Freud called eros, the Greek word for love. Eros is our life instinct, which causes our sexual activity and other creative life-producing drives. The opposite of eros, the life drive or love, is thanatos, the Greek word for death. According to Freud again, we live amidst the clash between these two drives. Life instinct or love and the death instinct, which is destruction. We produce and put effort through our eros, and we consume, demolish, and show aggression through our thanatos, knowing that one day we will all die. This death drive and life drive, libido and thanatos and eros, appear in the psychoanalytic theory, especially when it comes to the study of literature. We, again, will talk about these in the upcoming lessons. Now, let's do a creative activity. Freud progressed in his profession by getting a small grant, financial help, to work at the famous Salpêtrière Mental Hospital, which was an asylum, under the supervision of the specialist in hysteria, Jean-Martin Charcot. How do you think his experiences at this hospital helped him in his evolving work? You can first write your hypotheses, ideas, and then do some research if you like to be more informed about how Freud's work developed. Freud's analyses have had a fundamental impact on what we now understand as literary theory. His ideas affected virtually every 20th century critic. On the one hand, Freud's views have deeply affected the analysis of characters, authors, and readers, enabling a new understanding of characters or authors' hidden or contradictory desires. On the other hand, for Freud, literature is not just an illustration, but a source and authority for understanding those hidden desires and intentions. Let's focus on the unconscious to make things, again, more concrete. It was by listening to patients differently Freud discovered the unconscious. Inside every person, he said, there was something transmitting scrambled messages in a hidden language, trying to break through the conscious surface of life. Despite the limitations of Freud's assumptions, his conception of the human psyche affected all social sciences and medicine tremendously. This effect can be seen in our daily lives, as the following examples may show. Parapraxis, or lapsus linguae, tongue slip, is a very famous literary and psychological term that we use while studying both literary content as well as our popular daily life. According to Sigmund Freud, slips of the tongue, for instance, reveal the thoughts and desires of the unconscious mind. These slips of the tongue are called Freudian slips or parapraxes in plural. An example to parapraxis can be a woman, let's say, engaged to Kerim, might mean to tell her friend, I'm so in love with Kerim. But instead of saying Kerim's name, she might say, I'm so in love with Berkecan. Berkecan being the name of her ex-boyfriend. So here, Freud would hypothesize that this engaged woman still has hearts for Berkecan. But she, in that repressed state of mind, causes the name Berkecan come out while talking about Kerim. According to Freud, parapraxis is extremely important because oftentimes the unconscious comes to the surface through language. So next time, if you have parapraxis, hope not, remember Freud and focus on this instance, and it will tell us something about your repressed feelings. Now, there are some other very interesting facts about Freud's work. One of Freud's unnoticed legacies is about dogs. Now, Freud had a chow chow he named Joffy. Freud was using animal companions to soothe anxious patients long before it was common. Although he did not intend to do so, so he did not have Joffy as a therapy dog, he sometimes allowed his Joffy to sit in with his patients during appointments, and he noticed that his patients became measurably more relaxed at Joffy's presence. When the idea of therapy dogs was explored further in the 1960s, researchers drew support from Freud's writing about Joffy to help establish credibility for the use of dogs in psychology as therapy aids. So next time someone tells you Freud's ideas were rubbish, think about this Joffy and therapy dogs that are used today. You will see that Freud's ideas were well grounded because they were taken out of cases, because they were taken out of real life experiences with his patients. And Joffy's example exemplifies this. Now, to finalize this week's work, I want you to watch an episode of Kırmızı Oda. Study Mediha Hanım's story carefully. Try to understand the root causes of her problem. At this stage, we are only focusing on Mediha Hanım's problems. Do not act like a psychiatrist yet. We will do it next week. In the discussion section, discuss the root causes of Mediha Hanım's problems. Also, focus on how her repressed problems come to the surface. State any particular problem you see. Hypothesize. Be creative. Now, explore Mediha Hanım's case very carefully without making any judgments. Now, here is an episode of a TV series titled Genius of the Modern World, directed by Rob Cowling. You can find this episode on Netflix. I suggest you view this to learn, more about Freud, although it's not a very accurate and realistic portrait of Freud's life. It will give you some ideas about his life and work. And also, it will give you some insight about the period in which he lived.